Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Today we're having a panel in celebration of Black History Month. I'm Chacha Sonka, Deputy for Public Affairs here at U.S. Embassy, Kingston, Jamaica. For the next half hour, we'll be discussing the portrayal of the Black experience in film and TV. We will explore how African American experiences have evolved on the large and small screen and their influence on shaping American society, culture, and perceptions of African Americans. Before I introduce our guests, a quick note. We will not be having any consular questions today. I want you guys to save your consular stuff for Consular Conversations, which is happening on March 17th. So you can add any question or comment you have in the Facebook chat if you like. This is the first of two discussions. We will have another one on the 25th, and that one will be on lesser known touchstone moments in the Black experience. So now I'd like to welcome our guests. Today we have with us Dr. Nicosia Shakes. She's the assistant professor in the Department of History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California. We have Lanisa Wahid. She's the Director of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. And we have Raquel King, Vice Consular for Consular Affairs. Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to go ahead and get right into it with some questions. Dr. Shakes, I'd like to start with you. How has the portrayal of the Black experience in film and TV changed over time?
It has changed a lot. So if you look at where Black representation was in the movie and TV industries in the US in the early 20th century, or the turn of the early 20th century, then what you have seen happening over the decades is that the representations of Black people have become more and more complex as more Black people have become filmmakers, producers, writers, directors, investors, and actors, so that the entry of more Black people into the film and TV industries have actually brought with it more and different types of representations of Black people. At the same time, the problem with regard to representations of people of color, representations of queer people, representations of minority populations in the US has left much wanting. So we're still in a situation where the streaming services are majority white owned. The large movie studios are majority white owned, with the exception of the Oprah Winfrey Network, which has been very, very important to Black representation on TV. The TV channels, including the cable stations, are largely white owned. I think that it's important to look at how far we've come, but as well as look at the work that needs to be done. So early 20th century movie and TV industries, many of us know this, were often dominated by racist stereotypes of Black people. And you had films, for example, like Birth of a Nation, 1915, which basically was all about Black stereotypes. I want to give credit, though, to the Black filmmakers who have been in the industry ever since filmmaking was an industry in the United States. Because I think that there is a tendency to look at the Spike Lees and the Ava DuVernays and the Dee Reeses as people who, this is a new thing that's happening. Look at all the Black representation we have now. But these filmmakers are the successors of people like Oscar Micheaux, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, right? There were small film studios and writers and directors who were Black Americans ever since the beginning of film. The problem was just that the major Hollywood studios and the major TV stations did not allow Black writers, directors, etc., until at least the mid 20th century, or even as late as the 1980s. So there continues to be that issue of how we represent the Black experience, and that being actually dependent on one, having more Black people in the film and TV industries, as well as having more cases where you find white-owned production companies like Plan B Entertainment, which is co-founded and co-owned by Brad Pitt, having more cases of white-owned production companies actually having enough empathy and respect for Black people that they create opportunities for more Black content, which is something that you had actually with the Jeffersons, which is referenced in the title to this program, and many other examples.
So sounds like it's changed. It's changed a lot over time, and really with representation and who produces and who writes stories. Lanice, I'd like to bring you in and ask you about that. So, do you think the portrayal has been largely positive or negative, or it was more negative past, more positive now? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you so much. I basically believe it's been a mixed portrayal and certainly not even, especially with the advent of reality TV. I think the portrayal really tends to be more on the negative side than on the positive side. And especially when we're talking about the portrayals of African Americans, sort of plays into the stereotypical idea that some may have of African Americans: ghetto, poor, loud, uneducated, Black, angry women, thugs, athletic, and promiscuous. So I think with the advent of reality TV, we're really seeing that coming through. I think that film also has a very similar issue as well when we're talking about Black representation. First, when we're in a film, except in the case where the film was actually produced or had a Black director, we're often supporting actors to white stars, right? So even when the story is about African Americans, somehow there's the idea of the white savior coming through and helping these poor Black people that need some assistance. And that harkens me back to The Help. I watched the movie several times, and so for those of you that have not seen the movie, it centers around sort of a young, privileged white woman who writes a book about the experiences of two Black maids during the civil rights movement in Jackson, Mississippi during the 1960s. And what it is that the idea that the white savior comes to the rescue of a minority in a feel-good type of narrative. So it further dilutes the stories of people that look like me and minimizes them, and then very much simplifies the racial issues. You do have definitely some positives as well when we're talking about movie and film. And you always have to, I always go to Black Panther, something very, very recent, without a doubt, where you see the pride. There's a superhero that's actually Black. And there's a strong critique on the white hegemony. And you have other movies, that I grew up watching, like Love Jones, The Best Man, where you get to see different facets of African American life, where it shows that we are complicated people. We are not one-dimensional characters to be in support of a white actor as well. Thinking about TV shows as well in the 90s, A Different World, where you really see different African Americans coming from various backgrounds, all gathering together at a historically Black college or university. And that just gave you a snippet to say, hey, we do go to school, we are educated. And I think that did a lot, at least for my generation, to say, it's cool to go to school, it's cool to go to college. This is what college is like as well. And it really inspired a generation on the importance of education.
Yeah, I want to bring in Raquel. So Anissa and Nicosia talked a lot about some of those stereotypes, some of the lack of the diverse experience for Blacks in TV and film. What are some of those subtle conveyances, and what do they mean? How do they perpetuate those stereotypes?
So, honing in on what Lanisa just mentioned in terms of the white savior complex, you do see that a lot in our films. And what's unfortunate is that's not all of the stories. They may be based on true stories, like Blind Side. I love that movie, and it is based on a true story of an NFL star. However, why is it only those type of stories that get selected to be produced into a film? That is the problem, I believe. Or it's the other extreme, which is only focused on civil rights. It doesn't focus on the average African American day to day. And so you have something like that, but then you also have reality TV that's becoming a real issue. For example, like the Housewives or Basketball Wives. There's always this constant violence that's in that, where they're fighting against each other, and it's almost like it's a form of entertainment, but it's just drama, and it's not real actual life, I guess you could say. And part of it, I think, is the audience that wants this melodrama, but I also think that it's only portraying a certain type of people, and even then, I don't even believe that is their true story either. It's just the way that they're portrayed. In terms of other TV shows like Power and Empire, of course, these are major, they're mega TV shows. I've watched them both, and I love them both. I think the problem is that we focus on this drug dealer trying to get out and make a name for himself, and now wants to be different, right? And the same with Empire, this hip hop family that she had to go to jail for however many years to then be able to let them make it in the music industry. It's yes, hip hop is a part of our Black culture, but the problem is that we continue to go into these stereotypes of athletic people or music producers, and not expanding the possibilities for these young Black kids. That they only think that they can become an NFL star or a rapper instead of something else. And so, although I like those TV shows, I think that they still put us in a box, and it's a progression, but it's not where it needs to be.
Yeah. So just portraying certain types of people, or only portraying a single aspect of the characters that are in it. Nicosia, I wanted to ask you, so how do you think that the portrayal changes? You talked about when there are Black writers involved and when there are Black directors and producers involved. Does the essence of that portrayal, does it change depending on who has the power, who's writing it, who has the pen?
I think it does, but it also is reliant on a number of factors. And one of these is who owns the production company, who owns the distribution company. Which audience are you targeting? Are you targeting a quote unquote mainstream audience, which is majority white? Are you targeting Black people as your audience, etc.? So there's a question of who is in the production room and who is writing and directing, but also how do you want to present this? Are you presenting it in line with a kind of philosophy where you just want to make as much money as possible? Because one of the problems that you've had with regard to stereotypical depictions of Black people, people of color, etc., is that stereotypes are familiar, especially to audiences who on a day-to-day basis do not have any kind of relationship with marginalized people. So that what sells is what they already think of these people. And sadly, many Black people themselves support stereotypical depictions because they're entertaining, they're funny, they present you with a fantasy, etc. However, the inroads that we've had in the movie and TV industries have largely come from having more writers and directors who are Black. For example, Moonlight. Moonlight started out as an independent film. It was accepted by Black audiences and independent film fans before it even became an Academy Award contender. And it's an example of what happens when a filmmaker decides to write from their experience. It's based on Alvin T. McCraney's play, which is semi-autobiographical. He wanted to see a representation of a Black gay man in Miami, having immense problems with bullying, etc. And so he wrote it. And then Barry Jenkins, who also says that the movie reflects his childhood, came behind the movie, produced the screenplay, and directed it. And there are a number of other instances. You mentioned Boys in the Hood. John Singleton wanted to see a depiction of Black men in an urban environment that shows Black men as emotional, as fully formed emotional beings. Ava DuVernay's work, not just in film, but also in TV. My favorite TV show is Queen Sugar. Again, based on a novel written by a Black woman. The writing team and directing team are women of color. And Ava DuVernay spoke about wanting to not just see more representations of different types of Black people, but also representations of Black women that went against some of the mainstream images that you see of Black women. And I could go on and on and on about how important that is. So it really has to do with a concept that we call subjectivity, which is when an artist creates a work of art based on their experiences, based on their life. And so one of the issues that you've had with the perpetuation of stereotypes, the beginning of the 20th century, it was clearer. The ones that the stereotypes were like more in your face, the mammy, the black buck, the Jezebel, etc. Nowadays, the stereotypes that you see in reality shows are based on those centuries-year-old stereotypes. But one of the issues you've had with that is many of the people who are producing these projects, The Help is a clear example. It's based on a novel written by a white woman. The screenplay is written by a white man. So I'm not saying that Black people do not play into these stereotypes. They do. So we have many complaints against Black filmmakers, but you have to think of art as a subjective thing. The artist's biography, the artist's life experiences do matter. And as I said before, there have been instances where you've had white investors and white production companies creating, producing or backing or financing TV shows that show different aspects of Black life. But in those instances, they have usually consulted with Black people, and or they have Black researchers and Black writer directors behind the scenes. But something I want to say before I forget is that what we're talking about is not just having more Black artists in the film and TV industries, but different types of Black artists who come from different parts of the United States. Because when we have one type of Black artist, when we get fixated on one representation because we like it, then people keep reproducing that same thing. And then it leaves out other types of Black people. And in this case, gender is important because one of the complaints has been that there haven't been historically Black women filmmakers haven't gotten the type of racial and gender equality in the film and TV industries. That has changed a lot. But I'm putting that out there to see that there are also different types of Black people. So if you're talking about complex representations, we have to look at different facets of Black life.
Complex representation of the demographic as well.
What was that? That was
just to make
a complex representation of the demographic as well.
Right.
You know, Black people are not just one type of an experience.
right.
Yeah.
And just to go back to that, when I mentioned Power, for example, 50 Cent is the producer and he's executive on that, right? So it is a Black person who is creating the show, and it's through his experience as a person in the hip hop industry, in possibly was in the streets and then, wanted to do better for himself. And I totally understand that. But it seems to be one of the only narratives that we have, or one of the only types of creators that we have that's at the forefront as executives on these TV shows and films.
Yeah. But
So
it's
that's
his
exactly-
lived experience.
Right,
You
and
know,
that's fine.
but is it? And
others.
do these reflect the lived experiences, right? Or do they reflect just maybe one small aspect of the lived experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's definitely like one small aspect of the lived experience. Even for the films that I love, if we're talking about Love Jones, Best Man, or we're talking about TV shows like Insecure and Blackish, like it shows snippets of Black life, but there's no way that any TV show or any movie is going to entirely be able to represent the Black people because we're not monolith. We're very different people. No, there's no one way to be Black. We are complicated just like every other human being. And I think the biggest criticism I would have if we're talking about film and TV is that rarely do you see very complicated Black characters unless it's coming from a Black writer or a director or a producer. But usually they tend to be very one-dimensional, the funny friend, the supportive friend, things like that. Exactly. So we are very complex beings, and it's important that TV and film also reflect that.
And do you think even in that diversity that might not be there, the diversity of the experience itself, does it become by those that are watching it a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of only one type of person, of one type of living one's life? We talked about lots of different shows, and I know for me growing up, sometimes it was like the Fresh Prince of Bel Air and the Jeffersons, and that really changed the portrayal of the Black experience in film and television. And do you think that kind of what do you think is the up and coming version of that? But does that also showing that complexity and showing the differentness change that self-fulfilling prophecy as well?
Well, I think one thing to take into account is that we are in this digital age in where it's not just TV and film now. We have live streaming, we have streaming services. So YouTube, for example, it's on an individualistic platform. I can film whatever I'd like and post it onto YouTube, of course, assuming that I do it under whatever agreements that they have. But I can do that. And the same with Netflix and other streaming services. So now you're seeing this change in how we are having our experiences portrayed, because you have people like Issa Rae, who started off with Awkward Black Girl, which was a YouTube show that she created. And then she became so famous through that then that's how Insecure came out of that, right? And you have Netflix partnering with, I think in 2018, they decided to do this Strong Black Lead program with Black executives like Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay, Shonda Rhimes, and make sure that we have more representation across multiple shows, like you're saying, not just one type of person, but different types of shows that can be more representative of us as a diaspora. And Shonda Rhimes just signed this over $100 million contract with Netflix, and now you have shows like Bridgerton. That has become a big talk of, is Queen Charlotte Black, right? And then were there really Black aristocrats in Britain at that time, right? And so it starts to create a different kind of conversation, right? And that's just one example. But I think that you have, yes, Fresh Prince of Bel Air, you have Best Man, you have the 90s. To me, the 90s and the early 2000s is when you saw a lot of Black TV shows and Black representation in different ways. I grew up on Nickelodeon primarily, not really, Disney only had That's So Raven, but Nickelodeon had Kenan and Kel, had Cousin Skeeter, had, I can't think of how many of Sister. So you had at least 5 or 10 different shows, even Proud Family, right? We had all these different shows that were on this platform for kids. Then all of a sudden in the mid-2000s, these shows ended. Why? There's no explanation as to why they ended, because these were some of their highest rated shows. And I think part of it was because exactly what we talked about before. Who was behind the production? Who was behind cutting the checks and making the big time decisions? I don't think they were mainly Black executives or investors, and so that's part of that. So you saw this increase in the 90s and early 2000s, and then all of a sudden it just stopped. And now we're just now starting to pick it back up, and even then, one could argue about the colorism issues in Proud Family, for example, and the stereotypes within that, right? So now we're in this space of not just having Black representation, but also how does that come off? And are you being considerate of all the different types of Black experiences, right? And so I think
what is available? What's available
exactly.
now? What's still in the space?
I mean, we have, of course, we have Insecure, we have Blackish. From Blackish came Grownish and Black AF. You also have the documentaries from Ava DuVernay, like When They See Us, which was the Central Park Five. It was a real story that happened in Harlem. You also have the 13th, which talks about the 13th Amendment and goes into detail about systemic racism. So you have all these different shows, How to Get Away with Murder. I mean, the list goes on, right? We have so many now, and you're starting to see not just Black representation, but also Black female leads, like How to Get Away with Murder, right?
So we talked about how it's, shaped the past, right, in the 80s and the 90s. We talked about how it's, has that fulfilling prophecy. And, I want to ask you guys, and I'll start with you, Nicosia, but anybody else who wants to chime in. So in what ways does this shape the daily lives of Black folks, for example, from anything from, discovering different ways of self-expression, whether they're seeing people portrayed as artists, different professions, whether they're seeing people portrayed as lawyers, sparking civic engagement, or inspiring different like leisure activities, like for Lovecraft Country, seeing people who are also really into sci-fi types of books and lots of reading and that kind of genre. So how do you think that this shapes the daily lives of Black folks and youth and otherwise?
I think that it's important to recognize that representation matters. It matters to self-esteem, self-concept. There were a lot of Black people who became more interested in the African continent after Black Panther. Yes, Wakanda is a fictional African country, but that movie actually did a lot in terms of thinking of our connection as Black people to the African continent. And especially when you measure it against other representations of Africa in Hollywood, mainstream representations that have been very problematic. I think for Black people who have not seen their particular Black experience represented, it has actually helped to raise self-concept and self-expression. Moonlight, Pariah, which is not as well known as Moonlight. That's a movie by Dee Reese about a young Black lesbian growing up in New York. And those movies have done a lot in terms of talking about the different types of marginalization that queer Black people face, not just in terms of their relationship to white people, but also their relationship to Black people. I can't say much about how self-esteem has been shaped by some of the portrayals of some of the negative portrayals that play into racist stereotypes, because I'm not Black American, but I can tell you from my experience of speaking to my students and even just being a Black woman, when I watch some of those reality shows or even some scripted shows that feature the angry Black woman, it does make you take pause and wonder where did these represent? I know no one who acts like that. Am I supposed to act like that? Am I supposed to always have a response for every time someone insults me? Am I supposed to express myself like this all the time? So Melissa Harris Perry, for example, talks about the crooked room and how Black women's conceptions of themselves can be shaped by the stereotypes of Black women. So I do think there's an effect, but I also think that with increasing representations of different aspects of Black life, that we have certainly made advances.
And the things that are changing, and that's, you know, the bright spot that I think that there's a consensus that change has been happening, and that's good, and you know, more, we want to see more of that. So I think we're coming about to the end of our time, but one, I want to thank all of you for coming on and being guests in this panel today, for one, and I encourage people to continue with this topic. You know, in your homes, at watching movies at night, whatever. And again, thank you guys so much. We want to thank the viewers for coming to see this panel today on our Facebook Live. Also remind you guys that we have another panel on the lesser known touchstones in the Black experience, and that will be on February 25th, also at 10:30 a.m. And we hope that you will come back and continue the conversation with us then as well. So with that, I want to thank you guys so much for viewing, and we look forward to seeing you on the 25th.
Bye-bye.